So this is the first story in the collection, but it's actually the last story that I wrote. You'll hear about a character named Caroline, who runs through about half of the book, and this is a story about her and her mother, in a way. Mostly about the mother, but I knew when I started writing this book that the mother had left Caroline. And so this story I wrote in order to answer a question as to why.
So this is A Matter of Time by Kate Milliken. A hinge or a latch or some goddamn thing had rusted out, and now the front door kept swinging open like an invitation. This was when things were better than they had been, but still bad enough. This was in Calabasas, in a 5-room bungalow with a small square back porch that was partly detached, leaving a gap wide enough to catch a foot. The bungalow, with a little kidney-shaped pool with a cracked floor, empty, leaving only a slick of green pointing towards the drain. This was on the other side of a head-high block wall, on the outside of a sprawling new development and just blocks from a mall. A mall, for God's sakes. On the weekends, a line of cars snaked past the front windows, waiting to pull into the mall parking lot. It was watching all those people in their ripped-sleeved t-shirts, trapped in their cars, looking sweaty, drumming their hands on the steering wheels, that made Lori all the more restless. It's only a matter of time, Marty would say. He wanted more too. Caroline, their daughter, had to start kindergarten in the school on the other side of the mall. Lori was suspicious of the teacher. She never seemed wholly awake. And Lori was sure that it was not a matter of time at all, but rather a matter of whom you knew. So they were having friends over, select friends. Lori found recipes and wrote a questionable check for good liquor, plenty of it, select friends, and Nick Reagan. They knew Nick Reagan. Lori had a knack for finding things that looked more expensive than they were, of assembling the appearance of luxury. Through the penny saver, she found thin bronze figurines of marching stickmen, a la Giacometti, and candlesticks and a crystal chandelier, polishing what needed polishing with toothpaste and a toothbrush, bringing it all to a high shine so as to distract the eye from everywhere else. Marty called her brilliant and kissed her forehead and cupped her shoulders in his hands as if congratulating her for playing so hard a game that was clearly so unwinnable. They had gone to college with Nick Reagan, near Cambridge, Massachusetts. Not at Harvard, but a college not far from there all the same. And they'd enjoyed taking the liberty of saying they went to college in Cambridge, aspirating the A. Nick had always had a plan. If he hadn't spoken of it so often, Lori might have thought more of his plan then, before it all panned out. In the 9 years since graduating, he'd produced as many films, each one doubling the previous one's budget. Lori learned this from the interviews she'd been reading. Now, anyone could know Nick Reagan as well as they did. Maybe better. This was their 3rd attempt to have him over for dinner. Lori was finishing the canapes, fully dressed, slipped into a Lagerfeld ripoff, her hair teased up in a satin headband. But Marty was humming, still unshowered, moving through the house with a box of tools. She could smell him, his pleasant musk, wholly unfit for company. Caroline was sitting on her hands, sagged into the couch in a depressing tulle poof of a dress, looking small. She wondered if the girl could possibly manage to keep one outfit on through the evening. She'd been going through a phase for years of needing to wear each piece of clothing out of each drawer at least once a day. Marty found this funny, suggesting Caroline was practicing for wardrobe changes, another little thespian in waiting like himself. Lori felt Caroline watching her. A pitcher of spiked lemonade was sweating on the table. "Go change," Lori said, shooing her off with her hands. Caroline fanned the dress over her knees. "You said look nice." "Go on, please. Put on jeans. Help your dad." Maybe Marty had this one right, going about his day as he pleased. Nick could cancel again. But it irritated Lori to no end that Marty still had not dressed. She was reminding herself to hold her tongue, saying the phrase to herself, hold your tongue, as a kind of meditative mantra, and it was almost working. The previous night's argument had ended on the admonition, "We just do things differently, Lori." She wanted to be okay with this. She did. Marty was okay with it, after all. But the front door was still dropping open and sawing across the concrete stoop and back again. "Marty, please, fix that door and get dressed!" She was yelling. You could hear a sneeze in any room of this house as if it were right beside you. She need not yell. This too had been discussed the night before. Marty called it hollering. "Next on the list," he said. He sounded as if he were underneath the bathroom sink. What needed fixing there she did not know, but the fact that there was something more pressing than their front door made her skin hurt. She settled the last pastry into its line and lifted the tray with thoughtful arms out to the drifting porch. The idea was for everyone to sit there drinking and eating sticks of vegetables and small salty fingerfuls of canapes in the last of the sunshine, getting drunk before she served them anything substantial. She wanted to relax Nick Reagan, to let him know that they were still fun, kid and all, and that Marty was still waiting for his break, and weren't they just enough of a hard-knock story to warrant a bit of his time? Lori liked the feel-good story, for things to turn around. The movies Nick produced were this way, and Lori wanted to believe that it could be so easy. They were expecting Nick, Beverly Colton, and her new thing, Tad, or something small sounding like that, and an actress that Marty had met in one of his acting classes, Roberta. Lori had warned Marty that competition, especially of the opposite sex, was not advisable. "She's fat," Marty said, to be reassuring. Lori smoothed the tablecloth, turned the white heirloom china from an estate sale, and set the stemware out. Little tea lights lingered between each setting. It would be tight, 6 people sitting there, but they could wander in and out of the house, of course, and she was aiming for a certain level of intimacy. One of her fantasies for the night involved Nick Reagan divulging some industry secret, or even better, a personal one. Then they wouldn't have to ask anything of him tonight. Then she could call him in a few days, a week later, and mention that she'd just been thinking of the little story that he told. And wouldn't it be nice if there was an audition or something that Marty could come in on? They could visit afterwards and have another laugh about it. This was her darkest fantasy. They, Marty, just needed a fair shot from an old friend. Lori made it clear to Caroline that she could eat in her room and was to remain there after dark. They'd intended for Caroline to stay with a friend, but the friend's mother had phoned to say that the girl had been sent home with lice the day before. Lice. Lori spent 30 minutes after the car fingering her daughter's scalp, cursing the kindergarten teacher, but she saw no lice. And Caroline, aside from stripping down and changing outfits at every transition of the day, was a good girl, happy to do as she was told. And she had always been comfortable playing on her own. They'd never considered having a second child, as none of them, including Caroline, seemed to be in need of one. From the porch you could see into the corner of Caroline's room, and she was there now, pulling through clothes, holding them up, looking for something in particular. Lori made a note to pull the curtains there, but she didn't expect Caroline's being home to distract from the party in any significant way. Now, the last 2 times Nick had canceled, he'd had the decency to call hours ahead. But he might not this time. He could just not come. No call at all. This had not occurred to her before, and something left Lori as she stepped back inside, realizing this. The anticipation, the flutter that was keeping her moving on the tips of her toes, the electricity at her core, turned then, darkening like an amassing inner cloud. She stood in the kitchen a moment, listening to Marty tinker around, then bang at a pipe on the other side of the thin wall. And she knew that if Nick did not come that evening, she wouldn't have it in her to invite him again. It was this evening, or it was not at all. And what would that be? This. She would be here, walking distance to a mall, married with child. And when someone asked Marty what he did, he would still answer, freelance, student, odd jobs, this and that. She hated most his answering this and that. She looked at the cordless phone and she pulled away her headband. But there he was, early. Nick Reagan was early. He was standing in their doorway, pulling off his sunglasses to ogle at the broken, leaning door. She touched her cheeks. She had not done her makeup yet, as makeup should be applied last, so as not to have to step away and freshen up. A hostess must be available. She licked her teeth. Nick Reagan, she said, pushing her headband back into her hair and flattening her skirt. She felt she might cry. Don't tell me I missed all the fun, he said, giving the hobbled door a playful shake. He had such a toothy grin. She had not remembered his teeth, not like that. He was wearing a baby blue polo shirt, collar up, jeans, and loafers, positively put together. Caroline came running into the room as if being chased all elbows. Well, well, who is this? Nick Reagan bent at the knees. Caroline stopped dead. The pants she'd chosen were too short and too small, pinching the round of her belly. This is Caroline. She was just getting dressed. Our daughter. Didn't I mention? No, I don't think you did. Nick took Caroline's limp hand as if to spin her around, though neither he nor Caroline moved. It was right then that Laurie understood he was there just to stop by, to be polite, to satisfy the insistence of her many invitations. But he was headed elsewhere, somewhere better. This was why he was early, to bow out before anyone else arrived. My word, she looks just like you, Laurie. Caroline was between them. Yes, of course she did have the same auburn hair, that much was obvious, but she also had Marty's cheeks, the cheeks that gave him a bit of Brando, but left their daughter looking as if she was always about to blow a bubble.
Oh.
Laurie felt Caroline looking up at her before she even spoke. Mom, can I go change? Fish face. Nick stood. Caroline turned and ran back behind the wall. Who knew? Nick shrugged. I'd have thought Marty's jeans would have gone and fucked it up, but she's just gorgeous. Just like you, Laurie. He leaned over and kissed her cheek. Let me get you a drink, Laurie said. Her face was flushed. He smelled of cologne and cigarettes. She was unsure when she had last eaten. The juices in her stomach were audible. Only to herself, she hoped. I wish you could stay longer, Nick. She said it as if they'd discussed his escaping already. Why skirt it? It was that obvious. I've made an amazing lasagna, canapes. Can we have you for one drink? Gin and tonic? Yes? Tanqueray? Stay for two, won't you? Well, I don't eat cheese anymore. Bad for the skin. But yes, a T&T will do. I wish I could stay. Oh, but there are so many other things going on, of course, she said for him, waving at the air, excusing him from excuses, and handed him his drink. They went on like this for a minute, with Laurie nervously talking over him, until Marty walked in, showered and dressed, tucking in a t-shirt. He put his jeans back on. Good. Casual. Relaxed. Nick and he greeted each other as men do in a sporty backclap embrace of sorts. She had forgotten how much taller Marty was than Nick. She had read that it was good for an actor to be short, that the camera created the illusion of height or something. Marty was not short. But he was handsome, as he was aimless, and this was what had long ago attracted her to him. She was younger then, childless. Aimless was sexy. She'd been stupid. But she did love him, there was no getting around that. Marty did not know that Nick was halfway out the door. She moved into the kitchen and pulled on an apron as if there were more to be done, a larger party imminent. Nice place you got here, Nick said. Marty laughed. He was good at this part, moving people beyond any awkwardness. It's transitional, of course. Come on, I'll show you around, and he jokingly pointed in a circle around himself. He really believed it, that this was just transitional. Laurie's mother had been the same way, too, full of bubbling hope. It had gotten her nothing. Come on, Marty said. They walked around Laurie to the back. I'll show you the spread Laurie's put out. The house isn't much, but we've got a sweet little space out here. Nick flashed her a tight, apologetic smile as he moved past. All right then, real quick. She was mindlessly wiping down the clean counter. She dialed Beverly, wanting to tell her to hurry. Maybe he would stay if things escalated fast enough, but Beverly didn't answer. She was either on her way or picking up her new guy. He'd had his license taken away for speeding. Beverly had horrible taste in men. They weren't even handsome, just reckless. Laurie thought to pull the curtain in Caroline's room. Caroline was down on the floor, dressed now in a blue jumper, blue shirt, blue tights, squinting at a puzzle. Laurie went and fixed Nick another T&T and poured herself a Chardonnay. Marty had given it all up. It was the new trend, giving things up after decades of indulgence. This was right before everybody got bored and cocaine fixed it all. Laurie could see them through the kitchen window. They were facing the concrete wall beyond the pool away from her. The magnolia tree was not yet in bloom. Marty put his arm around Nick and bent towards him as if to share some confidence. She couldn't hear them, but she saw the lob of Nick's head and his shoulders rolling as he gave in to laughter. Then the two men broke apart, smiling in agreement over something. Maybe that was all. Maybe Marty had asked him for an audition, just like that. maybe she need not fret. She stepped outside. This could be nice, Nick said. Get that pool fixed up and you've got yourself something. Marty winked at her. Nick's excited for your lasagna, Lori. She took a big swallow of wine, feeling a dribble escape onto the rain of her gown. Fuck. My other thing, Nick started, but then paused, seeing the fresh gin and tonic in her hand. He took it and handed back the empty. It's nothing that can't wait. I'd much rather visit with you guys, given everything. Given everything? He'd lifted the new glass to this, towards Marty, and Marty toasted him with an imaginary drink in hand. Marty had used her, made her sound desperate for Nick to stay. Just another crazy woman desperate for a decent dinner party. That's how it was? But she was desperate, wasn't she? And shouldn't Marty be too? He had showered and shaved and tucked in his shirt, and now he was reaching for her glass of wine. Yes, he was desperate too. Desperate enough to use her to make Nick stay. Marty, she wanted to say, it seems we don't do things that differently after all. I'm glad you'll stay, Nick. It's not a very cheesy lasagna anyway. She smiled at both of them and took her glass back from Marty before he could drink it. I promise. She touched Nick's arm when she said this, and he looked down at her hand as she did so. She felt a heat in her armpits. She pulled her hand back and sipped at her glass, looking to Marty, who was pointedly looking off towards the wall. Nick fingered his ice, looking at his shoes. There was a scraping sound of the front door swinging open again, and Lori knocked back her wine. Beverly's new guy was, in fact, named Tad, and he was terribly small. Comically so. It relieved something for everyone, except Tad, of course. Roberta came up the walk behind Tad and Beverly as if on cue, a kind of punchline. She was quite fat, with a real waddle on her, thick-ankled, big drapey dress, and salty. You didn't have to break the door off to fit me in. Way to flatter a girl, Marty. What a ragtag bunch. Tad didn't talk much. He sat back in his chair like a sulking child while Beverly leaned forward, curled in interest over the table, just positively fascinated by what Nick had to tell of the films he'd worked on, the stories he'd had. Nick kept stroking his thin mustache, feeling quite sure of himself, aware of his stature among this group. Plus, Beverly had a way of making you believe that what you were saying was the most interesting thing in the world, nodding her head as you spoke, mouth open as if mildly stunned by the magnitude of even your most trivial remarks. But then, when you'd concluded, she would, after a pregnant pause, blithely tell a story of far greater interest, all the while fiddling with her cascade of blonde hair. She was a gem. Priceless, really, with her ability to cut people down without their even knowing. You could practically hear their knees go out. Lori had invited Beverly for just this reason, for leveling Nick Reagan if necessary, just enough leveling to make him feel as if they were worth his time. Beverly had a Jack Nicholson story in her pocket. She met him as an extra on a comedy. She'd run lines with him, among other things. The concrete wall was lit up tangerine orange with the last of the day's light. It was the only decent part of being against that wall, the backdrop of shadows and the way it held on to the colors of sunset like a late Rothko. It was almost cinematic. It was the only almost cinematic aspect of their lives, and it was why she wanted everyone out here, for this light, for the illusion that they were in the world. Lori had personally poured Nick 3 drinks by this time, and she thought she saw him at the bar table inside at least once. Marty must have felt her thinking, calculating, as he reached under the table, pulled her gown up over her knee, and rubbed the muscle there. He'd been telling her that she was getting too thin. She didn't see it, but she liked how clean she felt when her stomach was empty, clean and strangely full of energy. Right, Nick was saying. I was on that picture with Jack. I remember you. You do? Beverly asked. Jack and I are friends, Nick said. He winked at Beverly, a lazy wink, heavy with drink. Beverly looked defeated. Roberta had made a segue from Nicholson to Polanski and was going on about the scandal, as crude as could be, but Nick turned to her, raising his glass. Hey, you're funny, he said. I might have something for you. You got that fat thing going on, too.
Oh my God.
Great, Roberta said and snorted with a confident kind of pleasure. Was he serious? Lori looked at Marty. Marty put his hand on top of hers, reading her thoughts as he sometimes could. Nick was getting up and squeezing behind Roberta. For a moment, Lori worried he was leaving, that he was laughing at them, unimpressed, and leaving. Can I get you a drink? She almost yelled this. Getting it myself, he said. I blame the mother, Roberta was saying to Marty, having dropped back to talk of Polanski. Roberta was cheery-faced as only the plump can be, and Lori was filled with a fiery hate towards her. She had an audition. Her mouth was positively offensive, vulgar. Marty probably found this doubly amusing, giving Lori's prudish bent. Polanski can go fuck himself. It's the mother who ought to go to jail, Roberta said, then leaned her head back against the house as if to go to sleep. She had, up until right then, seemed oddly unaffected by 4 vodka sours. With Nick inside, Tad became awfully talkative, going on about his numerous traffic violations, all of them for speeding. Lori registered his talking as directed at her, as if she were interested, and wondered how long he'd been speaking to her. She thought herself rude, but quickly returned to angry indifference. It was only Tad. Half the time I get off using the flow of traffic defense, he was saying. Oh, please, Beverly said. That worked for you once, and it's bullshit. It's not bullshit. It's how it should be. If we all want to be going 90, why shouldn't we all be going 90? He's a keeper, Marty said to Beverly. Like you guys are such good people, Tad said under his breath. Lori could smell the lasagna inside, the bubbling cheese she promised herself she would not touch. Undoubtedly bad for the skin. We are good people, Marty said. Don't be such a prick. You don't know us. Right up until you're rich and famous, Tad said. It took him a moment to arrange the word famous in his mouth. He'd had 2 gimlets and was nursing a whine. Shut up, Tad, Beverly said. Lori had not intended to drink so much. This isn't how I thought this would go, she said to Beverly. She'd lost count of her own drinks, busily eyeing everyone else's. Where is she? She. Where is he? Lori mouthed to Marty. The bathroom, Marty said at normal volume. Please ask him already, would you? He's got dozens of things in the works, obviously, she said, tossing her head in Roberta's direction. Do it before he's too drunk to remember. Marty rolled his eyes at her. She hated that. He'd gone ahead and had a glass of wine after all. The faint smell of mothballs moved off her dress. Marty, please. Lori, I will. Timing is everything, all right? The lasagna was burning. Inside, Lori started to pull the pan out of the oven when she heard Caroline's voice. She'd forgotten about Caroline behind the drawn curtains. She did this sometimes, losing sight of her at the park, lost in her own daydreams. Surely all mothers did this sometimes. It was nothing to be alarmed over. She was just talking to herself, though not in the same way she did when pretending. When she played, she spoke for everyone, without pauses, never stopping to listen, the whole story flowing freely. But she'd gone quiet now, as if listening. Someone was with her. Lori closed the oven door quietly and stepped into the small hallway that connected the front of the 2 square bedrooms and the bathroom. The bathroom door was open, vacant. But there was Nick, around the corner, standing in Caroline's doorway, talking in a hushed tone. Lori thought she heard him say, "You like school?" or "You like clothes?" Through the crook of Nick's arm, she could see Caroline's still-made bed, the comforter pulled taut. But the oversized pink clock on the wall had tilted somehow, leaving the 2 where the 12 ought to be. Sometimes Lori could hear its oversized ticking in the night, when the house was still, when she lay awake in the dark, hungry, wishing for things. Nick turned around as if sensing Lori behind him. Now she could see Caroline standing at the mouth of her closet, a pink dress in one hand, a red dress in the other, with only her underwear on. Oh, Lori said. Hey, Nick said. He was visibly drunk, the way he'd propped himself against the doorway. Lori was quickly sober, sweeping past Nick. Did you need help with that, Caroline, honey? Let me help you. She pulled Caroline near the bed, where she held the girl between her knees, tugging the red dress down over her head, all the while Caroline grunting in a small, helpless protest. I can do it, Mom, stop. Nick came over and sat down on the bed right beside Lori, Caroline still wedged between her legs. She really is lovely, Lori. Look at that dress. Lori saw as he slumped to sit that the button of his jeans was fastened, but his fly was unzipped. A simple mistake coming out of the bathroom, and then there was Caroline, who happened to be changing yet again. That was all. And now Nick just needed to sit down for a moment. He inhaled deeply and set his drink on the wood floor between his legs. I have a daughter myself. Do you know that? He asked. I didn't know. I didn't. How old is she? In all her reading, she'd seen no mention of Nick having a family. Let's see, I'm not really sure. Maybe 3? I don't see much of her, of course. Her mom is, well, young. Estelle. Funny, right? An old name like that. Nothing old about her, though. She lives with her parents. Then he laughed. When Lori did not laugh with him, he stopped, then shook his head. They don't want much to do with me. Just send a check. I see. I send plenty, believe me. Caroline pulled away to push the hair from her eyes. Lori had been holding her arms as if she were liable to float away. Nick reached over and touched Caroline's hair, tucking it behind her ear. Lori stood up, feeling short of breath. She wanted to throw open the window behind them. Marty was right there, right behind that curtain. Just lovely, Nick said, looking at Caroline. The lasagna was burning, Lori said. We should go. She pulled Caroline back by the shoulders. We should go, she said again to Nick. But he didn't move. He was looking at the drink on the floor between his legs. Water was pooling beneath it, darkening the wood. It moved ever so slightly, slipping on its own wetness. Let's get back outside, Lori said. Marty wants to talk to you. Of course he does, Nick said, not looking up. I know that, don't I? Lori could feel her daughter's breathing, the small rise in her shoulders with each inhalation. Lori took her hands from Caroline and backed away, towards the door, going. But Nick Reagan didn't move. And a thought gathered then in Lori, dark and odious, just long enough for her never to forget it.